This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next hour, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from across Africa and beyond. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenya capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a quick run through the market here for you. So the NSE here in Kenya wasn't trading today. Nonetheless, if it closes the year pretty much at these levels, you're looking at an 8.3% decline so far in the year. Stretch it out to 5 years, though, the picture becomes a lot more bleak. It's actually down by almost 50%. The JSE, despite all the power issues we're going to be talking about in just a moment, actually did close in positive territory. It's on course to essentially close the year about 6% higher. Gold producers, in fact, were actually the ones who are driving mining indexes, the mining index rather, higher to levels we've not seen since July 2008. Some of the key gold producers like Anglo Gold and Anglo American up by over 1.8%. Here's what's coming up tonight. South Africa's power crisis will be resolved soon, according to the president, even as he mentions sabotage might be to blame. We'll take in a test drive of Uganda's domestically produced electric bus. And we'll introduce you to the brains behind Tunisia's Intego. It's a scooter hailing app that's easing a transport crisis in Tunis. All right then, quite a bit to get through tonight, but let's start Global Business Africa in South Africa, where President Cyril Ramaphosa says he suspects sabotage was partly responsible for the outage of at least 2,000 megawatts of generation capacity during the week's outages. A week of heavy rain across parts of the country did cause flooding and aggravated problems at the cash-strapped power firm Eskom. But the president, who remember had to cut short a trip to Egypt to deal with this crisis, is now calling for a deeper investigation into the matter.
What has also come out as a great concern is that there has been a measure of sabotage that has led to the loss of, during this period, of 2,000 megawatts, where someone in the Eskom system disconnected one of the instruments that finally led to one of the boilers tripping and us losing as much as 2,000. I think it was 2 boilers.
Now, there's quite a bit to get through as far as this story is concerned. So let's bring in Sumitra Naidu to help us unpack it. She's live in Johannesburg right now, the latest developments on this. So, Sumitra, what's the latest on the power supply situation at the moment in the country?
Well, Rama, we are still on stage 2 load shedding, which means power cuts will happen for 2 hours at a time over a 6-day period. Now, some of the substations that went down this week have been repaired and restored. The rain has also eased up for now. Eskom said last week that coal supplies were rain-soaked and couldn't be burned, obviously compromising electricity generation. Some power stations were also flooded. Those have dried out now. And, you know, as we saw in that clip just a short while ago, the president briefing the media yesterday and suggesting that an emergency plan was being finalized to ensure a stable power supply from next week, Tuesday. We're still waiting for details on that plan, but he assured there would be no power cuts from the 17th of December until the end of January. Of course, there's lots of concerns going around because now there's, issues around sabotage coming up. I think South Africans are just really, really angry with what's happening at the moment and they don't know what to believe. Rama?
Indeed. So according to the president, as you mentioned, he says specifically he thinks there was sabotage at the Tutuka power station in Mpumalanga. Tell us more about that. What exactly happened and who does he think is responsible?
Well, so yesterday was the first time we heard of this possible sabotage. In that media briefing, the president said that sabotage had caused the loss of 2,000 megawatts of power for 10 hours, but he didn't specify where and when the incident took place. He said someone in the Eskom system disconnected one of the instruments that caused one of the boilers to trip. Now, an Eskom official also confirmed this, saying, they realized the damage when one of their safety monitoring systems had been disconnected at one of the boilers. Now, the instrument monitors whether a flame is active in the boiler so that you don't put more coal in when there is no fire. This in turn helps prevent damage to the boiler and possible explosion. So that essentially, that monitoring system triggered, it tripped and the boiler didn't work. Now, the president said the police have been called in, an investigation is underway, but that's all we know at this point. We haven't had any update in that regard. Ramah?
Right, one last question for you. Do we have any idea, though, how long it would take to bring in a large amount of non-Eskom generation capacity into the grid? And if so, at what cost?
Well, Ramah, we've been covering the story for years now. South Africa, like the rest of the continent, is ideal for renewable energy because we have plenty of sunshine and wind, and in terms of producing hydropower. We also have nuclear in South Africa, but, cost has become a major factor. We've been unable to continue with nuclear, for example, because we can't afford it. But over and above that, there just hasn't been enough political will to implement other alternative energy sources in order to ensure that Eskom holds on to, and this was because Eskom needs to hold on to this monopoly in the country. I spoke to some experts today. Take a look. It's day 8 for load shedding in South Africa. The frequency of power cuts has been reduced down to stage 2, but the national grid remains under pressure.
They have an aging coal fleet of power stations that are in excess of 30 to almost 50 years old. Those coal-fired power stations, they were not maintained adequately. Therefore, they are incurring unplanned breakdowns. The third issue is that in terms of the Medupi and Kusile power stations, there are supply issues that they're experiencing with regards to the coal that needs to go into the plants. And there are also design flaws in terms of the construction.
Now that the problem is so dire, many are hoping the government will look at alternative energy sources.
The embedded generation, like rooftop solar PV plants, present huge opportunities in South Africa. We already have a lot of facilities. For example, our own campus here on the CSIR, we already supply a substantial portion of our electricity needs from our own local rooftop solar PV plants. And many shopping malls and centres, schools, clinics are following suit. And that's a huge market potential in South Africa because we have excellent sunshine all year round.
There are a number of energy alternatives that can be implemented and should have been implemented years ago. But Eskom has consistently delayed these projects and in some cases blocked them completely.
The first option is to explore immediate power purchase agreements with independent power producers. They're going to look at issuing an RFI to procure 5,000 megawatts. The second option is to accelerate the renewable power producers from around 4.5 to ensure that they meet their operating dates earlier than expected so we can get more power onto the grid. And the last option is to accelerate what they call the gas to power program, and that is to import gas from areas like Mozambique and use that gas to generate electricity.
An announcement is expected in Parliament Friday. It's not clear whether it will be related to a plan for Eskom or an alternative solution to fix the energy crisis. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa. Well, there you go, Ramah. There's plenty of different solutions and alternatives that can be implemented. Whether government decides to implement that is another story altogether. It's back to you.
Indeed, energy policy conundrums left, right and centre. Sumitra Naidu in Johannesburg. Thank you. Now, Uganda's tested its first domestically assembled electric bus, which could see the capital city of Kampala take it up as a means of public transportation. Now, despite easing congestion, the bus is also environmentally friendly. It's going to be running on a lot of green energy here. CGTN's Leon Sanyange reports on the 90-seater's first road test.
the mega switch from diesel engines to an electric-powered ride. This is Uganda's Kayola electric bus.
It's a low-flow entry city bus. Low flow meaning somebody can just jump on, hop off without needing stairs.
Spacious inside, equipped with security cameras and screens, the bus seems comfortable. It can carry up to 90 people and cover a distance of 300 kilometers with a single charge of electric power. The bus is out on yet another road trip, and this could be the longest so far, a 130-kilometer journey from the capital to the central part of the country. Several road tests have already been done to guarantee it is roadworthy. Officials say this will be a big step in the city's plans to go green.
We'll actually undertake a 12-month study with the 2 buses that we will have built to best understand in what way can we introduce electric buses to urban centers in Uganda and beyond in the sub-Saharan region.
City residents can expect to start riding on the buses by 2021. The allure of riding a bus already has some excited.
It has been my dream. I've heard of Kira Motors, but I've not I haven't got an opportunity to walk into it and board it. You understand? So it's something that I cannot wait for it.
The Ugandan car company Kira Motors Corporation plans on assembling many more. Leon Sanyange, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
All right, then some corporate headlines now. Starting in Uganda, the power distributor in the country, Umeme Limited, has secured a syndicated loan of some $70 million. The cash is going to fund infrastructure upgrades and grid expansion too. The deal was signed by the International Finance Corporation, South Africa Standard Bank, and Netherlands Development Finance Corporation as well. The commodities trader Vitol has signed a 10-year deal with the Nigeria liquefied natural gas firm to buy some 500,000 tons of LNG every year. The move ramps up its long-term presence in the market as commodity houses expand the spot trade volumes in a push for much cleaner, or at least less polluting, forms of energy. Boeing's 737 MAX and all its variants will not be taken to the skies until American regulators determine that the aircraft is safe after its involvement in 2 deadly crashes. FAA Administrator Stephen Dixon told the U.S. House Transportation Panel there was no calendar or schedule guiding the clearance, effectively suggesting regulators are not taking Boeing's preferences into account. And finally, on transportation, Nissan's new CEO, Makoto Uchida, has announced that he's solely focused on restoring trust and regaining credibility for the company in the wake of the scandal involving Nissan's former CEO and chairman, Carlos Ghosn. The scandal initiated a very uneasy 3-way alliance with Renault and Mitsubishi. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore Ethiopia's near $3 billion bailout with the International Monetary Fund. And Nigeria joins a list of countries on the continent that will issue other African nationals with visas on arrival.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. The International Monetary Fund has given preliminary approval for a $2.9 billion loan to Ethiopia to assist it in its economic reform program. Now, Ethiopia is currently carrying out a range of economic reforms that include opening up some state-owned monopolies to some foreign investment. CGTN's Coletta Njohi has the latest from Addis Ababa.
Ethiopia is fit for a financial package worth $2.9 billion. That is the initial assessment of the International Monetary Fund. As it awaits final approval by the fund's executive board, Ethiopia says this is a great show of confidence in its economic reforms.
We want to make sure we unleash the full potential of the economy and also resolve some of the key macro challenges. One being foreign currency shortage. Right? People are asking, in terms of export, you're not doing well, maybe because there are some logistic challenges that require forex intervention, or some of our manufacturers are not not producing full capacity, maybe 40-50% because of some forex shortage. So what this resource does is help us unlock the full potential of the economy.
The country is also tackling poor managed state-owned enterprises and a weak private sector.
Broadly speaking, both the private sector and the public sector side is much work to do. Private sector is still very young and small in Ethiopia. It needs to grow up very fast because the world is coming here if we don't go to it.
Ethiopia hopes to change its economy in 3 years. Ethiopia says it needs up to $10 billion to successfully execute its economic reforms. Its biggest challenge, however, is accumulated debts of over $52 billion. Most of this is from external borrowing. Ethiopia's Ministry of Finance says its economy still has room to borrow loans, but wants to be careful not to accumulate debt.
When we unveiled ongoing economic reform, we've identified sources of finance. And we said specifically, we would like to get more grants, more concessional loans, more private sector investments, more export receipts, and so on. I mean, this kind of healthy source of finance. And that's what we are mobilizing now. So in a sense, our constraint is only on commercial debt.
Already, plans are underway to invite 3 new investors into the country's telecommunications sector. Consultations have also begun to open up 13 state-owned sugar companies to foreign investment. The economic reforms are the initiative of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who took over leadership in April 2018. He has promised to make Ethiopia more attractive for investment and in turn create more jobs and inclusive growth. Coletta Njohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Right then, quite a bit to get through as far as Ethiopia and this deal with the IMF and the World Bank, as you're about to hear, is concerned. Let's talk to Zemedene Nagatu, who's the chairman of the Fairfax Africa Fund. He joins us now live from Addis Ababa. Zemedene, great to see you on the program tonight. I know for a very long time Ethiopia has been reluctant to even ask for bailout from the IMF or the World Bank, but here we are with this $3 billion deal. What happened?
Well, Rama, thank you for having me back on your program again. As you indicated, Ethiopia has just been granted or is about to be approved for $3 billion from the IMF, and you asked why now. I think to me, it's a very simple answer. They apparently believe very strongly in the economic reform program of Ethiopia. In fact, it's called the Homegrown Economic Reform, which was announced a little while ago. So in a simple way, they are saying, you know what, we believe on the upside growth potential of the economy. They believe in the transformation of the economy from a primarily state-led, which actually has delivered very strong growth in the last few years, but it needs to transform and start allowing more of the private sector to come in. I think, so for them to support that reform, they thought it was very important, and they believe that Ethiopia has a very huge upside potential in terms of growth. Even though the economy is forecast to grow about around 7.7% this year, to sustain that kind of growth, a lot of transformation reforms have to take place. And if you've seen the government's homegrown economic reform program, it has 3 pillars, one of them macroeconomic, sectoral, and structural. On the macroeconomic side, which is where I think the IMF can provide a lot of support, both financially and technically, if you look at the constraints that is holding back the economic growth, for example, shortage of foreign exchange. So in that area, this financing with the technical support from the IMF, I think will help a lot. As well as, I think, to reform the economy. The inflationary pressure on the economy this month, for example, inflation was officially at 20%. Again, to reduce that, I think the transformation, the economic program has given priority and focus. So when you look at it in totality, the bottom line is both the IMF and the World Bank. It's not just 3 billion, I think, as the minister indicated earlier. There's another 2+ billion coming from the World Bank. These are very large numbers by African standards, and I think it's a vote of confidence by the IMF and the international community that Ethiopia's economic reform, given the right kind of support, can sustain and even accelerate the growth that has shown over the last several years.
Right. The reform side of this, however, does require Ethiopia to address that foreign exchange shortage, but at the same time transition to a much more flexible exchange rate regime. And there's also an element of strengthening oversight and management at state-owned entities, because there's a lot of debt that's built up essentially in books on that end of the world. But let's start with the currency side of it. What path will Ethiopia take? Is it going to gradually devalue the birr, or will it essentially do what Egypt did and say, look, let's just take the pain up front, devalue the currency, float it, move on?
You're asking a very interesting question. Now, I'm not certain what the government's decision will be, but I'll share with you what my view is. I think as the economy reforms, remember this year, in 2020, the Ethiopian economy will top $100 billion. So that's a very sizable economy in the emerging markets, and certainly in Africa. So I think some reforms, overall economic reforms, as I mentioned earlier, but also on the Forex aspect. Today, there's a very rigid FX allocation process in place. Obviously, it hasn't really delivered the results that the government was looking for, and also the demand from the private sector, from exporters, is much more significant than the availability. So I think my view is a gradual easing will be the more appropriate one, as opposed to the drastic, safe devaluation. And also, in my opinion, I don't think an immediate liberalization, the full float, I don't think it's in the works. Now, I may be wrong, but my experience shows, and I've spent many years in Latin America when they have these kinds of challenges, I think it's better to gradually liberalize, make it a bit more flexible than it is now, because to sustain a fully floating currency, you need very large reserves, you need very sophisticated institutions to support that. We'll get there, but I'm not sure we're there yet. So it's just my view. It's probably better to have a gradual liberalization, make it a little more flexible than it is now. And then at some point, maybe in the future, we can fully float the currency. But I think that might be just down the road. But probably you get a better answer, a much more accurate one from the IMF and the Ethiopian government. But my view is it's better to gradually liberalize it than one big bang, free float. I think you mentioned, I think the Egyptians had done that. But I'm not sure we're there yet. We're still at about $100 billion. We still have to build very strong institutions. Yeah. As I said, even though the economy's been growing over the last 12, 13 years, it was a state-led model. So the regulator was the state-owned companies being regulated. Now you have more and more, as the Prime Minister said, the private sector in Ethiopia will have a bigger role in the economy. That means the mindset as well as the institutional capacities have to evolve along with that. So right. I'm just suggesting we take it gradually in terms of the currency floating approach. Okay, so a lot of these reforms tend to be painful. There's a lot of dislocation involved. You wake up one day, the value of the birr is at, say, 28, and tomorrow it's at 35, whatever the number might be. Does the Prime Minister have the political will and the social backing to implement what essentially are painful but necessary economic reforms at this point? All right, so it seems that we've lost that connection there to Zemedine Negatu. He's, of course, the chairman at Fairfax Africa Fund. We're speaking to him live from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And just for the sake of context, the Ethiopian birr, as controlled as it is, has actually moved from around
28.5 to the dollar, all the way to around 32 in the span of the year. And the big chunk of that move has actually happened in the run-up to the announcement of this particular deal in the month of December. Now, on to Nigeria. The government today is awaiting Parliament's approval for a $30 billion loan, despite the country's rising debt profile. The country's public debt load at the moment is about $84 billion, but the extra amount of debt that they're looking to acquire is expected to be allocated towards narrowing the fiscal deficit. CGTN's Kelechi Mekalam now reports.
Recently, Parliament passed Nigeria's $35 billion budget for 2020. It set an oil benchmark of $57 per barrel at a daily production rate of 2.8 million barrels. But funding is proving a major challenge. There's a budget deficit of over $7 billion. So President Buhari is seeking Parliament's approval for external borrowing of nearly $30 billion. That's in the face of a rising debt profile, which currently stands at about $84 billion.
Out of every naira, 100 kobo, we use 54 kobo to pay back debt. So that's not a sustainable percentage to use to pay back debt, because we are not talking about recurrent non-debt expenditure. We are not talking of capital expenditure. So that means we have a debt problem as well as a revenue problem. So the concern is that sooner than later, we may no longer be able to service the debt, or we'll have an option of having to forgo critical infrastructure, having to forgo social issues like education and health because we want to pay back debt.
Nigeria has been struggling to keep its economy afloat since emerging from its 2016 recession. The World Bank predicts Africa's biggest oil producer may be heading for another recession as global oil prices continue to fluctuate. And experts warn that rising debts could be detrimental to the nation's economy.
There are quite a good number of alternatives which have been built into policies, like the National Integrated Infrastructure Master Plan 2013 to 2043, which is a 30-year master plan. It talked about how to fund infrastructure. Government was not supposed to provide all the money. Government money was supposed to leverage private sector capital. And to leverage private sector capital, you needed to enact some new laws, amend some existing ones which are not private sector friendly, enact new policies. Most of those recommendations in this policy, this framework, had not been done by the federal government.
Nigeria's debt figures showed a year-on-year increase of nearly 13% from the end of June 2018. The debt figures rose from $63.8 billion to nearly $84 billion at the end of June this year. And the current debt to GDP ratio stands at almost 17%. It's not the first time President Buhari is requesting for the loan approval. The previous parliament turned down his request. But his loyalists are in key parliamentary positions now, so there are higher chances of his getting an approval. Kelechi Mekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Well, still in Nigeria, the country's president, Muhammadu Buhari, has announced that his country will start issuing visas on arrival for all African nationals. Once this policy takes effect, it's expected to be a major boost for the continent-wide effort to ensure that the movement of Africans across Africa is a lot less stressful. The change in visa policy by Nigeria comes off the back of the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Nigeria effectively joins Kenya, Rwanda and Ethiopia as countries that have recently set up visa on arrival policies for all African nationals. But easing visa rules is one thing. Smoother air travel and cheaper air travel for travelers across the continent, well, that's quite another. The African Union has recorded progress in this regard with the launch of the Single Air Transport Market Initiative, but a lot more work still needs to be done. And still in Nigeria, yet again, the central bank has banned foreign exchange purchases for imported cassava products. Nigeria has been importing at least $600 million worth of cassava derivatives every single year. The move, according to the CBN, is designed to boost the country's local production. Our correspondent, Jack Mangut, brings us more.
Bulus Magaji has been a cassava farmer for more than 10 years now. He says most of his harvest ends up as food for his family.
I've been farming cassava for many years, majorly to feed my wife and children.
I need the government's support with capital so I can produce more for the market and even export.
According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, Nigeria is the largest producer of cassava in the world. The country produces about 50 million metric tons annually. However, 90% of that is consumed as food instead of being processed to other products like ethanol, starch, animal feed, among others. As a result, Nigeria is forced to import processed cassava products into the country. The Apex Bank has now decided to put a restriction on foreign exchange for the importation of these cassava products. The government is hoping to improve the productivity of cassava farmers and encourage local processing of products like starch and flour. Analysts say this move could lead to the creation of jobs and more revenue for the government.
Once discover that cassava will bring a lot of money to the economy, many people will want to invest into agriculture. Then the entrepreneurs will want to actually process this product into different kind of products, and by product will be encouraged to set up factories in Nigeria.
Experts say the government also needs to provide power and infrastructure to encourage more people to go into cassava processing.
Also maybe to provide a basic infrastructure that will promote the production and the exportation of this product from Nigeria.
The government says it is partnering with the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture to support over 50,000 farmers to produce and process about 1 million metric tons of cassava yearly. Until then, cassava farmers like Bulus can only look forward to when they can expand their production and even export their products. Ajek Mangut, CGTN, Abuja.
Time for a short break. You're watching Global Business. Here's what's coming up next. The United Kingdom heads to an election in what's expected to decide the fate of Brexit. And we'll take into a real estate firm that has everyone talking by giving its employees a bonus of $10 million.
No one again began holding guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Business in Africa is at the crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
Look at some economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed.
And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives. News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference. How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself. If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Let's recap the stories making your headlines at this hour. Starting in Niger, President Mahamadou Issoufou has cut short his trip to Egypt after an attack on a remote army base in the west of the country left at least 73 soldiers dead. Another 12 are currently missing. That camp borders Mali, which has witnessed several militant attacks. The Islamic State in West Africa has claimed responsibility for that assault. In North Africa, Algerians have been voting in a highly disputed election. Critics say that all candidates should be removed because of their ties to the unpopular former government. The vote comes in the wake of the ousting of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika earlier this year. He was forced to resign in April. He'd been in office for at least 2 decades. And finally, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the United States wants to work with Russia to end the conflict in Libya. Pompeo made that statement following discussions with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. That's a run through, or rather, there's actually one more story here for you. A mobile court has been introduced in the western equatorial town of Yambio in South Sudan. The court system is being used to dispense justice in remote parts of the country that lack legal structures. More than 100 cases will be heard by the end of the year. That's a run through your headlines. Right then, so United Kingdom voters did go into the polls today in an election that will effectively pave the way for Brexit under the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, or propel the United Kingdom towards another referendum that could ultimately reverse the decision to leave the European Union. After failing to deliver Brexit by October 31st, Mr. Johnson called for the election to break what he described as political paralysis that had thwarted the UK's planned departure and sapped confidence in one of the world's largest economies. Elsewhere across the Atlantic, the US Federal Reserve has left its benchmark lending rate at between 1.5% to 1.75% after its final policy meeting for the year and the decade as well. The US Central Bank also suggested it had no plans for any changes in 2020 despite pressure from the White House. Here's CGTN's Giles Gibson with more.
Fed Chairman Jerome Powell wrapped up 2019 with a bullish outlook for the US economy.
Our economic outlook remains a favorable one, despite global developments and ongoing risks. With our decisions through the course of the past year, we believe that monetary policy is well positioned to serve the American people by supporting continued economic growth, a strong job market, and inflation near our symmetric 2% goal.
Markets on Wall Street jumped slightly after the final rates decision of the year. US President Donald Trump has spent much of 2019, though, attacking the Fed and its chairman. In a speech in New York last month, he accused the central bank of holding the US economy back.
It puts us at a competitive disadvantage to other countries. Yet in the face of this reality, our economic policies have ushered in an unprecedented tide of prosperity, surging all throughout the nation.
While insisting on its independence from the White House, the Fed has given the president some of what he wants. Powell has steadily cut interest rates over the course of 2019 amid uncertainty in global trade. Some of that uncertainty is starting to lift, with the USMCA trade deal between the US, Canada and Mexico almost over the line. The Fed also removed an earlier reference to uncertainties from its monthly statement, perhaps signaling optimism over the US-China trade negotiations. The state of those talks will become clearer in the next few days, with the next round of US tariffs on Chinese goods looming on Sunday. Giles Gibson, CGTN, Washington.
On to France now, and continued strikes in the capital have brought the city close to a standstill. Union workers have vowed to continue their walkout and mass demonstrations against planned government pension reforms. But the workers did make one concession, but as Tony Waterman now explains from Paris, it's unlikely to get people off the street.
Universality, fairness and responsibility. Those were the principles French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe said the pension overhaul would stick to.
Il n'y a pas d'agenda caché.
There is no hidden agenda. We are not looking to penny pinch here or there. We don't want to hurt anyone. On the contrary, we want to protect the purchasing power of workers and the purchasing power of pensioners.
In a major concession, he said workers born before 1975 would not be affected by the changes at all, pushing the reform back more than a decade. But union workers aren't satisfied.
The age measures announced are insufficient, particularly on the issue of hardship. I am meeting with the CFDT National Office to find out how we will act in the coming weeks.
The government also stuck to its promise to keep the official retirement age at 62, which is among the lowest in Europe, although workers will only receive full benefits if they work until 64. France's 42 different pension schemes will also be condensed into one universal system, getting rid of the so-called special regimes, which offer exclusive benefits like early retirement to certain employees. It will also become a points-based system, with workers receiving points for each hour that they work. It's unclear, though, how the value of these points will be determined. On the streets of Paris, reaction has been mixed.
To me, it's a scam. They say the legal retirement age will still be 62, but it's actually a way to reduce pensions, because if we do not work until the pivot age, which is now 64, we won't get the pseudo bonus and our full pensions.
If it's implemented, I think it's great, but I don't know where the money will come from, as the country is already in debt. How will it be funded? I've always had doubt about these kinds of promises.
Certain jobs, especially the most painful ones, should be kept apart from this new reform, even though it's good to have some other jobs.
The details of the plan have done little to quell union resistance. A massive protest is planned for next Tuesday, and the strike is indefinite, meaning the gridlock in and around Paris could be here for Christmas. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Paris.
All right, and a quick recap of essentially what we've been covering on our station all day. Voters in the United Kingdom essentially going to vote today in the polls. Those polls are going to be closing at about 10 p.m. local time. Not too far away from now, as a matter of fact. But the fact of the matter is that the election has been cast as a way of breaking the deadlock that we've seen in the House of Commons with regard to Brexit. So, will something actually change? Let's find out. CGTN's Naweed Balkil joins me now live from London. Naweed, how's voting been going on all day?
Well, Ramah, polls open at 7 a.m. GMT here, and they'll close in about just over 3 hours' time. 650 seats in total up for grabs in the House of Commons. Behind me, that's across the United Kingdom as well. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and England, people have been turning out to cast their votes. Among them, Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He was joined at the polling station by his dog, Dylan. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, the main opposition party, he cast his vote here in London, in North London, in his constituency. And then other party leaders like the Liberal Democrats, Jo Swinson up in Scotland, and Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP Nationalist Party leader in Scotland, casting her vote in Glasgow. This is the first winter election since 1974, the first December election since 1923. As you mentioned, Boris Johnson calling this about 6 weeks ago. He said in order to break the Brexit impasse. In terms of the reaction that we've seen on Twitter, one thing that's been making lots of headlines has been dogs, funnily enough. I mentioned Boris Johnson took his dog along to the polling station. He wasn't alone. London Mayor Sadiq Khan did the same, and thousands of others have done the same across the UK, choosing to post photos on social media of those dogs in polling stations. In terms of where the results go from here, 10 p.m. is when the polls will close, with an exit poll coming out shortly after that, but full results should become clearer sometime on Friday. Ramah?
Indeed, we'll leave it there for the time being. And Noe Jamahil, live in London, part of the team, of course, covering the general elections in the United Kingdom. Now, Cambodia is one of the most climate vulnerable countries on the planet. It relies heavily on agriculture. But extreme weather caused by climate change has devastated crops, and that in turn has forced farmers to abandon the fields and find other jobs, particularly in the brick industry. The problem there is that they're walking straight into a poverty trap. Our correspondent Dusita Sako reports.
Long shadows of Cambodia's edifices of wealth and progress conceal a deeper darkness. Each brick fueling the nation's growth symbolizes the blood, sweat, and pain of the country's poorest inhabitants. It's the type of job nobody chooses. The air is thick with soot catching in the throat. It is so hot the heat stings every part of your body. The hours are long, the work grueling and often dangerous. Children are running everywhere. There is no safety equipment. Stories of illnesses and debt bondage are commonplace.
I don't have any way to pay back my debt to the owner. We get exploded. I owe money, so that is why I have to work. Some days we don't make enough to eat.
Meet Charong came to this brick kiln with his parents years ago. He now lives here with his wife and parents. His wife just suffered a miscarriage. He makes just $2.50 a day if he's lucky. He is $1,900 in debt. Every day is a struggle for Meet Charong and the tens of thousands of people working in over 400 brick kilns across Cambodia.
The living conditions in this brick kiln is horrific. Entire families live in these tiny little huts. There's no toilet, no electricity, no running water. It's overcrowded, poorly maintained, completely lacking in sanitation. Yet despite this living condition, it is an industry that is in no shortage of new recruits.
But why? Debts that push people to the kilns are today driven by new realities. In spite of fast development and economic growth, almost 80% of Cambodians live in rural areas. About 45% of the labor force directly employed in agriculture. But the agricultural sector has been battered by weather extremes in recent years.
10 years ago, harvest was better. Fishermen can sell more fish. Farmers can sell more rice. Now everything has changed and more people are in debt.
For almost every farmer in this province, it is now a story of coping rather than doing, of managing in whatever way possible the task of farming in an environment no longer suited to age-old methods.
Last year, I got 3 harvests. This year, I got 1 harvest. There is no water. I rely on rain, but there's no rain. My rice plants are too dry.
Kon Sokia knows that all it takes is just one failed harvest that can lead her family into unsustainable levels of debt. And for the indebted farmers, one of the only remaining choices is to sell the family debt to the owner of a brick kiln and set out on what they know in advance will be a journey in one direction. Lucita Sao, CGTN, Kandal Province, Cambodia.
The fashion industry is coming under increasing scrutiny from consumers like you and I who want to know where and how and by whom the clothes are produced. The increasing global demand for fashion has resulted in water, chemical, plastic pollution, you name it, not to mention the vast increase in carbon emissions related to the industry. But often smaller manufacturers and retailers are using innovative solutions to deal with the environmental damage caused by the fashion industry.
Fish skin, pineapple leaves, and apple peel. Not the discarded ingredients of a gourmet meal, but materials used by innovative designers to make clothing and accessories. European designers are looking for creative solutions to global problems, particularly waste.
The textile industry is getting close to working out how to do fibre-to-fibre recycling. So what that means is that when you take a garment that's no longer needed, you can break it down into the fibres and turn that back into a raw material to make new clothing.
3 years ago, 37-year-old commercial engineer and sustainability consultant Tom DeHoo decided to try producing jeans without damaging the environment. His brand produces locally in Europe, cutting down on transport and reducing its carbon footprint.
This is actually where we harvest our cotton. Instead of taking new cotton that grows on a field that requires a lot of water to grow, we use the cotton that's already around, and these now will be shredded and made back into the fibers that we'll use for our yarn.
Another Belgian fashion designer, Sebastian de Neuburg, is recycling plastic bottles, car dashboards, and refrigerators to make fashionable sunglasses. The 34-year-old former engineer quit his job 3 years ago to set up his own company and used crowdfunding to start his brand. Plastic waste is collected and shredded to make 3D printer filament.
Waste, I believe, is a design failure. And I very much believe that the future economy and the future products that we will have and use, there will be no such thing as waste.
The UN's Economic Commission for Europe estimates the fashion industry is responsible for producing 20% of global wastewater and 10% of global carbon emissions. That's more than the emissions of all international flights and maritime shipping combined. Greg Lafredi, CGTN.
A commercial real estate developer is handing out a total of $10 million in bonuses to its nearly 200 employees. St. John Properties, you might have heard about this particular company because of that clip on social media. It's worth more than $3.5 billion, collectively the company that is. It announced a payday at a recent end-of-year party. Now, the average bonus was some $50,000, but some employees will get upwards of $250,000. Now, the bonuses essentially celebrate the company's achievement of developing some 20 million square feet of office space, retail and warehouses. St. John said they were able to award everyone with the extra cash because they hit a milestone in their portfolio in developing all that space that we mentioned across 8 states in the United States.
Just got a huge bonus from Mr. St. John for your tenure. We reached 20 million square feet, and we just got a big payday. Woo!
Wow, it was very generous of Mr. St. John and Larry and Lori, and it's life-changing.
And I wanted to make it meaningful for the people who did it. You know, I steer the boat, but they're the ones that run the boat. They're the ones that make the boat go.
And it was our way to give back to our employees who have been with us. We are our longest tenured employees, 45 years. The shortest starts on Monday. And so it was a lot of fun. And from the day I started with Ed 38 years ago, he has told me, and I've heard it thousands of times, Larry, the employees are the foundation to our organization.
Right, quite a few happy employees there. Quick run through commodity prices, if you will, for the time being. $64.34 a barrel is where Brent crude is at. But really, the outstanding commodity, really, as far as naked gains are concerned, is palladium. In fact, at today's levels, it's over $1,940 an ounce. That's a new record. It's much higher than the all-time record on gold. Today's the 15th straight day of gains. This year alone, it's up over 53%. Back to oil very briefly. Saudi Aramco essentially is up 15% ever since it started trading. So the prince did get his $2 trillion valuation very briefly in today's trading session. It was hit, but the question still remains, at what cost? Here's what's coming up next. We'll introduce you to the brains behind Tunisia's Intego. It's a scooter hailing app that's dealing with a transport crisis in Tunis.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. Let's wrap up the hour in Tunisia, where a new startup is offering commuters an alternative to hard-to-find taxis in an effort to enhance the country's transportation options. CGTN's Ucho Koronkwo tells us how a company called Intigo is making public transport in the country cheaper and faster on grassroots tonight.
If you ask any of the 1 million residents in Tunisia's capital, Tunis, traffic is a nightmare. A newly launched startup called Intigo is now weighing in on their daily struggle to find efficient transportation by introducing the country's first taxi scooter.
We launched the taxi scooter because we saw that the biggest obstacle for the Tunisian people is transportation. No matter their social group, age or gender, everyone has a transportation problem.
Intigo's taxi scooters use a similar model to ride-hailing firms like Uber and Bolt. But the founders say their scooters are at least 30% lower than the price of an ordinary taxi and easier and quicker to find on Tunisia's busy streets.
The way to use Intigo is by downloading on your smartphone an app that we developed in our office. It is very easy to use. After installing the app, the passengers just have to specify their location and destination, and the scooter will come to them, and the app will tell them the cost exactly.
The idea is very good. It's going to facilitate the transportation of people and passengers because we have a huge problem in the public and private transportation sectors. So the presence of this motorcycle is going to facilitate the transportation of citizens.
Intigo says it only hires certified motorcycle drivers who are required to take several tests before they're employed. If a trial run proves successful by December, it plans to distribute some 50 taxi scooters in at least 3 other cities. Uche Okoronkwo, CGTN.
All right, then a brief run through some currencies here for you. The Kenyan shilling essentially getting under the 102 mark. It's been there for a while now. 101.68 is the relevant number. This is a currency, remember, that was around 104 not too long ago in the third quarter. Nonetheless, on the debt side, some interesting things happening. Probably just holiday blues checking into the short-term debt auction. The government came to market looking for about $240 million. They only managed to raise about 120 or so million dollars in the auction that they held a little earlier in the week, because today, of course, is a public holiday here in Kenya. That's a run through your currencies, and that's it for tonight's edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. There's several ways to get your thoughts back to us. All of them are on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.